What's up guys, Manny from Motomillion, and this is the ultimate brake guide for the Streetfighter V4 and the Panigale V4. And we're going to be covering all the submodels of these platforms that I mentioned, since the braking component is pretty much the same on all the submodels, with some exceptions that I'll get to. And these bikes already come from the factory with some really good components. And I think the weak point is some of the servicing aspect of it, that they don't come with the best bled brakes from the factory. But before we go any further, let's break down the components of the braking system and the upgrades for it. Let's talk about our brake calipers, and let's start with the front end. These bikes, as I mentioned, come with the Brembo Stahlbus calipers, which is one of the best calipers that Brembo has made so far, and they were introduced on the Panigale V4 when the bike was introduced. You've seen us praise these calipers over the years and offer them as upgrades for other models of motorcycles because they're such a great caliper, especially at the price range that they're in. And if you want to upgrade your Stahlbus calipers, there's two things to consider: visual upgrades and performance upgrades. Visually, I'm pleased to say that Brembo is now offering them in black and red colors, so if you could visually upgrade your calipers, as we did with our SP2 project that we have over here, that we opted in for the black and red calipers. I think it should have come from the factory with the black and red calipers, since it matches the bike's theme as well. And I know some of you guys are going to ask, well, this bike came with the Stahlbus R calipers, isn't it a downgrade? So let's talk about that. Some of the submodels of these platforms that we mentioned come with the Stahlbus R calipers. The only difference is that they come with drilled pistons. The drilled pistons offer cooling through the pistons that are in place, that are drilled, that allows airflow through them. And 99% of us who would even ride this and push this thing to its limits at the track would not notice the difference between a drilled piston and a non-drilled piston. And again, if you're swapping over a colored Brembo caliper, it is very simple to just swap the pistons over. Then you could have drilled pistons as well, so your colored caliper will technically be a Stahlbus R, that's just a different color. But if you're going after the performance upgrades, the GP4 MS caliper by Brembo is top of the food chain. And I think it's a great upgrade if you want to go the route of really upgrading your brake calipers. They come in that beautiful nickel plating finish. And also it's a direct swap, so you don't have to touch your brake lines, and basically you just remove the stock calipers, put them in place, bleed them, and you're good to go. There's also the GP4 RX calipers that are slightly better than the Stahlbus calipers that's on the bike, but considering the fact that you have to install custom brake lines to make them work, it's probably going to cost you as much as installing the GP4 MS calipers, since you have to swap the brake lines, and given that a professional is installing these, the cost of installing them plus the calipers will make it very close to the GP4 MS calipers. Now that we talked about the front calipers, let's quickly talk about the rear caliper. The rear caliper of this bike is an underslung setup, which is a dual piston caliper. It's a cast Brembo caliper from the factory. Again, it's a great caliper. You could upgrade it, and you could go with the billet lineup of Brembo, which comes in nickel plated color and also the black anodized color that will match some of the other colors of the Stahlbus calipers up front. And as you see on our SP2 project, we ran with the black anodized caliper in the rear because visually it matches the front. It is a better caliper than the factory cast caliper, but most of us riders, as I mentioned, would be hard pressed to notice a difference in the performance this rear brake caliper upgrade offers. And there is no shame in upgrading things for the visuals of it, because at the end of the day, we want to personalize the things that we own. Talking about the rear brake caliper, I'm going to talk about a subject that's a disclaimer that has nothing to do with upgrades of your brake system, but it has to do with your rear sets. The room for error is very little because, especially on the models that have carbon fiber wheels on them, the heat that's generated by the brakes can cause some serious issues like the failure of your wheels. So if you ever install any rear sets, have it serviced, or touch the rear axle of your bike in terms of the braking, make sure that your rear wheel is spinning freely. There is no drag on that rear brake. That's where we see all of the wheel failures happen when you're running carbon wheels on this bike, be it aftermarket carbon wheels or running these factory carbon wheels that come standard on some of the models of the bikes. And when I talk about the rear brake drag, there is a setting of your brake lever for your foot lever on your rear sets that adjusts that. Take a look at it, mention your mechanic who is servicing your motorcycle to check that out for you. Now that we talked about our calipers, let's move on to our rotors. On the front axle, you have our Brembo T-Drives and Brembo Super Sports, which act as an upgrade to your motorcycle. They're fully floating as opposed to the semi-floating front rotors that are on the bike from the factory. This is pretty standard across the superbike range, and it's the same on the Panigale V4 and the Streetfighter V4 platform. By running these fully floating rotors, you're reducing the brake drag that is caused by the rotors being non-floating, but also you're upgrading the material and the heat capacity of your rotors. The T-Drives feature the proprietary T-Drive system that the Brembo has to offer. It's the top of the line. It's something that they came up with after racing for many years in MotoGP and the World Superbike Series. And as you saw on our M1000RR build, even though the rotor has a thicker rotor band on the outside, it is actually lighter because of the carrier of the rotors being designed in a specific way. Also, the Super Sport rotors, they are fully floating. They have the round floaters on it, which are the traditional floaters, but also it comes to a visual upgrade where the center carrier is a gold color as opposed to the T-Drives being a black color. In terms of the brake rotor upgrades for the rear end of these bikes, unlike other super bikes, there are no ultralight rear rotor options for these bikes, but there are some really good upgrades that are both lighter and visually better looking rotors in the rear. And this is the braking rotor that we carry, which is a wave rotor. It's the lightest of them all for this platform, but we also have the Ducati rotors that are in the back end for this bike that are used in many racing series in Europe. Again, it's visually a little different looking than what you have on the motorcycle from the factory. It is also a thicker rotor, which gives you that added heat capacity that you would want. Now that we talked about our rotors, let's talk about our brake lines. This platform comes with great lines because they're stainless steel braided from the factory, but you could upgrade to the carbon fiber brake lines by Frentubo, which give you that ultimate braking feel because they do really well under expansion and they withstand 16,900 psi of pressure before they burst. Yes, that's right, 16,900 psi. But given the labor-intensive installation of these brake lines, someone who's really looking for that ultimate brake feel on their motorcycle is going to want to install these, because then again, if you bleed this system correctly and to the best that it can be bled, the stock brake lines do really well in terms of the braking feel. And talking about the braking feel, let's move on to our master cylinders. All of the submodels of the Streetfighter V4 and the Panigale V4 platform come with Brembo master cylinders from the factory, but these are Brembo OEM lineup master cylinders. And over the years, they were prone to some issues, but that's just wear and tear. But if you want to upgrade your master cylinders, the Brembo RCS and the RCS Corsa lineup would be the right upgrades for you. And also, the things to consider when you're replacing your master cylinders on your motorcycle, on the front axle, will be the type of caliper you're running, because that will dictate which model of the RCS or the Corsa that you're going to be running, meaning it's going to be either RCS 17 or the RCS 19. If you're running the stock style lemma calipers, because of the size of the pistons of these calipers, Brembo recommends running an RCS or a Corsa 17 master cylinder. And if you're running the GP4 RX calipers, Brembo recommends running the Corsa 19 or the RCS 19. And just like your style lemma calipers, the GP4 MS calipers are recommended to be used with a 17mm master cylinder. But if you know the braking feel and the character that you're after, there is nothing wrong with running a 17 or a 19mm master cylinder on any of these calipers that we mentioned. One thing to consider when you're upgrading your brake master cylinder is because the way that the hand controls are on these motorcycles, given your throttle switch and your start-stop switches that are on the handlebar, you're going to need to eliminate at least your start-stop switch and use some aftermarket start-stop switches, which give you more room to bring that brake lever a little further inside so that you have clearance with your throttle. Also, one other thing to consider is that your clutch master cylinder on these platforms are hydraulic clutches as well. Once you upgrade to an RCS or an RCS Corsa on the brake side, you might want to consider upgrading your clutch master cylinder for that visual upgrade. But again, the clutch master cylinders that are from the factory are plagued with the same problems that the brake master cylinders are. So it might be a good upgrade to consider the 16mm clutch master cylinder, be it the RCS 16 or the RCS Corsa 16mm for the clutch side. And one other thing to consider is, once you upgrade your clutch master cylinder to these racing master cylinders that we mentioned, there is no clutch switch for these master cylinders. But good news is, there are banjo bolt switches that you could be running on these motorcycles if you'd like to. They're not the visually best looking things to run. That's why we never run them. But if you don't run your clutch master cylinder, your quick shifter is still going to work and all the other electronics are still going to work on your bike, but you're not going to be able to start your bike in gear. The bike has to be always in neutral before you start it. For those of you guys wondering the difference between the RCS and the RCS Corsa Corta lineup, internally they're pretty much the same, except the Corsa Corta lineup has a new body style on it, and on the brake side it allows for one more adjustment, which is the pivot point, which Brembo calls as being adjustable in terms of the brake bite point, where it has normal, sport, and race adjustments, that it dictates how aggressively the brakes are applied when you pull that lever. Once you upgrade your brake master cylinder and or your clutch master cylinder on the front end of the bike, your stock brackets for your reservoirs are not going to work. Your reservoirs will work because the nipple size is 6 millimeters from the factory, since it comes with Brembo OEM master cylinders, but your brackets will not work. So it's a good time to upgrade to the Rizoma reservoirs, or you could run the Brembo's aftermarket reservoirs that are available for these bikes. And in terms of the Rizoma reservoirs, all of the reservoir kits that we provide come with the proper brackets to install on your motorcycle. But also, if you're going with some sort of a custom setup, as we did on our SP2 project, you could run the TWM custom reservoir mounts, where you could bend them into the shape and the place that you want your reservoir to be in. Also, one thing to consider, as we did on our SP2 project, you could run 2 small reservoirs to have that symmetrical look on your motorcycle. There is no downside of performance when you run these reservoirs on your motorcycle, except you better keep up with your braking service, because there's less fluid, which means that that fluid will degrade faster as it sees more and more heat cycles over time of use. In terms of the rear reservoirs, you could upgrade to a Rizoma reservoir, where again it's a visual upgrade. It comes in various colors, or you can upgrade to these beautiful integrated reservoirs by Moto Corsa, as we've done on our SP2 series. Again, it's only a visual upgrade. There is no performance upgrade with these reservoirs. Now let's talk about our bleeder valves. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, the bike comes with some great components for the braking, but I think the bleeding of them from the factory leaves a little bit more to be desired for. And this is where our Stahlbus bleeder valves will come into play. On the front axle, you could be running the double banjo bolt on one side, the single banjo bolt bleeder on the other side, and on the rear axle for the calipers, you could be running the Stahlbus bleeder valve on that rear stock caliper. All the fitment lists for these components are found on our website, and if you need further help, if you reach out to one of the Motomillion team members, they could easily direct you to the right product. And in terms of our master cylinders, on the front brake master cylinder and on the clutch master cylinder, you could be running the Stahlbus bleeder valves. And on the rear master cylinder from the factory, there's no bleeder valve on it, but you could add a Stahlbus single banjo bolt bleeder valve on it, so that you could easily bleed them through the master cylinder as well. And without boring you guys to death, what makes these Stahlbus bleeder valves so great is that one-way check valve that's inside of those bleeders, which doesn't allow any air to go back into the system while you're doing your brake bleed procedure. But furthermore, even the threads of these bleeders are sealed, so that when you crack that bleeder open, no air can go through into the system through your threads. Let's talk about the reservoir tubing that's available for these motorcycles. You could upgrade to the Tygon tubing on the front end of this bike for your clutch master cylinder and your brake master cylinder. It gives you that visual upgrade that you could see your brake line through these clear hoses. It also helps with the bleeding of things, because if there's any air in the system in those hoses, you get to see it and you won't allow it to go into the system, and you'll catch it up front, rather than running a black hose which is not see-through. And I'd like to mention the disclaimer that it's not advised to run a Tygon tubing for your rear reservoirs on these motorcycles, because of the amount of heat that's generated by your exhaust system will melt that Tygon tubing. Stick to your factory tubing or any tubing that's supplied to you with your reservoir kits. Now that we talked about the tubing, let's talk about what fills those tubes. Let's talk about our brake fluid. As mentioned on all our brake upgrades and throughout our videos, we only use the Brembo HTC 64T brake fluid on these motorcycles. It is a rather expensive fluid, but it is the least compressible fluid that's out and on the market, and it could withstand any temperature that you would throw at it compared to any other brake fluid that's available. But again, this is something of a personal choice, that everyone has their fluid based on price range and the performance of it. But let me mention this, the Brembo HTC 64T is also very resistant to heat cycles. from our experience, be it on track or on the street, it withstands a lot more heat cycles than any other performance brake fluid that we've seen. Now that we talked about personal preferences, let's talk about brake pads. We're not going to give you any recommendations on brake pads just outright, unless we know your riding style and the feel that you're after. And if you already know the type of riding and what you desire from your brakes, you already know what brake pads to get. But let me mention that any of the calipers that we mentioned that we offer to you guys, if you purchase them from us, they come with Brembo sintered pads in them. They're great for street use. They could do some mild track use, but again, if you're after a certain brake pad, do your research, find the type of riding you're gonna do, the style of braking that you want from your motorcycle, and choose your pad accordingly. One last component that I'm gonna mention are your brake cooling ducts, because there's some great options for these motorcycles. Since they come with brake caliper spacers, and Full 6 offers these brand new caliper cooling ducts that fit instead of your caliper spacers, which is a great performance upgrade. And I say it's a performance upgrade because it, number one, cools your caliper, because unlike cars, most of the heat generated on motorcycles stay within the caliper, and that's your first area of attack to cool things down. But furthermore than just cooling things down, it pushes away all the brake dust that's generated when you're braking. This also lengthens your maintenance and your life of your caliper pistons, because unless something is pushing away that brake dust, it starts accumulating over your pistons, which then it gets caked on with the heat that they see, and then going in and out of the piston seals, they'll start wearing them down prematurely. So these brake cooling ducts do a great job with maintenance as well. And other than all of these pros with performance and maintenance, they look amazing. They're available in gloss finish and satin finish to match your taste. Now that we ran through all of the components of this motorcycle in terms of your brake upgrades, if you have any questions still left after watching this video, if we reach out to one of the Motomillion team members, they'll be more than happy to help you answer any questions that you might have. And if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. Until next time, guys, have a good one.